distinsul istoric, diplomat, profesor, Ernest Jr., pe căruia îi mulțumesc și domnia sa înțelege pentru că înțelege românește și vorbește un pic. Sper să ne și exemplifice. Deși și-a manifestat licența de a vorbi liber și extins în românește, pentru că, sigur, intelectual de calibru ține și la diversitatea lexicală, stăpânirea nuanțelor. Clar ce spun? Sau... Ok. Puteți repeta, vă rog?
Acum ar trebui să fiți.
Sunt de acord.
Sunt de acord, spune domnule Latham. Ok. Vă mulțumesc tuturor că ați venit. Aici, în atmosfera atât de agreabilă de la Club A, nu mai e frig, s-a făcut primăvara afară și aerul condiționat nu ne mai îngheață. Atmosfera atât de agreabilă și muzica lui Santana și ce am fost mai devreme, atât de agreabilă încât colegul nostru Iohesan, care ne ajută cu microfoanele și cu sonorizarea, deci care are grijă să fie microfoanele pregătite, când mă îndreptam la mine spre el cu privire interogativă, nu-și dădea seama că e nevoie de microfon, atât de plăcut era atmosfera cu muzică și cu taclane între dumneavoastră toți. Înainte, before switching to English, I will okay. Deci, înainte să începem, efectiv, să stăm de vorbă cu domnul Ernest Latham. Două vorbe despre domnia sa. Ele erau, de fapt, prinse și în anunțul pe care l-am distribuit și pe care cred că toată lumea l-a văzut. Pretextul acestei întâlniri, al acestei seri și motivul pentru care acum domnul Latham este în aceste zile în București este prezentarea cărții sale Timeless and Transitory, cu subtitlul, pentru că ochelari, 20th Century Relations Between Romania and the English-Speaking World. Deci, în traducere improvizată, an istoric deasupra timpului și, în același timp, cum să traducem mai exact? Atemporal și tranzitoriu. Deci, v-aș caz un titlu oximoronic și, în același timp, ironic, construit între ideea de durată indefinită, de anistoricitate și ideea de timp scurt, care trece foarte repede și deci care se opune duratei lungi. E o carte în care Ernest Latham a adunat studii de istoric specializat, între altele, în chestiuni românești. Textele privesc istoria românească sau interferențe dintre istoria și cultura română și cultura internațională, în primul rând cea, bineînțeles, English speaking. Scriitori britanici sau americani, jurnaliști britanici sau americani, dar și businessmen și cercetători care s-au ocupat cândva de România și care în felul ăsta ne oferă în panorama improvizată de asamblajul acestor texte o imagine a României de-a lungul modernității, să spunem, de-a lungul secolului 20 spre prezent. Nu în analize ample și care să privească global, holistic, mai pretențios, istoria românească, ci focalizând asupra câte unei teme, dar fiecare dintre ele explorată extrem de minuțios și transformată în maniere spectaculoase de-a dreptul în acele cioburi de oglindă care răsprind întregul cer, întreaga istorie, ca să reiau metafora italiană cunoscută, care se referea la roman, dar merge și la istorie, căci, cum știm, narațiunea e mama și a literaturii și a istoriei. Domnul Latham a fost diplomat în România, la ambasada de la București, și-a dat un doctorat, și-a obținut un titlu de doctor la Universitatea din București, s-a întors în Statele Unite, a revenit în România în diverse ocazii, a predat la Universitatea Babeș-Bolyai din Cluj, din postfața lui Bogdan Antoniu tânăr profesor la Facultatea de Istorie de la București, la Universității noastre. Am aflat că a fost și Fulbright profesor la Facultatea de Istorie. De asemenea, a colaborat cu texte la diverse publicații, în special de cercetare și academice. Deci textele din această carte sunt indicate drept articole, eseuri, dar sunt de fapt studii. Aproape toate. A colaborat deci pe teme românești la diverse publicații și volume internaționale. A contribuit la opere lexicografice care privesc România și actualmente predă cursuri despre România pentru viitorii diplomați americani la București. Diplomații care sunt deja numiți în post la ambasada din România și înainte de a veni aici sunt mai întâi antrenați puțin, ca să știe unde aterizează. Domnul Latham este un perfect antrenor pentru asemenea colegi americani care vin aici să exercite serviciu public pentru guvernul și poporul statelor, națiunea statelor Unite. Domnule Latham, vă întreb în românește, veți răspunde în englezește, dar am convenit de ieri ca domnul Latham să facă și efortul de a mai presăra discursul, răspunsurile și cu vocabule românești sau cu propoziții românești. O să încep prin a ruga să ne povestiți cum a survenit în biografia noastră întâmplarea numită România. Cum ați ajuns în România? How did you first arrive here? Was it a pure haphazard, or did you have any kind of thought about that previously, an attraction? Did you have any knowledge about that? Who taught you as a future diplomat in Bucharest about Romania?
Well, I first had an interest in Romania in the mid-70s. I was at that time stationed as a political officer in our embassy in Nicosia, Cyprus. And I happened on a magazine with pictures of your famous painted churches in Mare Mureș, and they fascinated me. I was born in Bukovina. I was born in a town in the United States, which had a large Greek Orthodox population. And so I was familiar with paintings inside churches, but I was not familiar with paintings outside churches. And a few years later, I was stationed with the American military government in Berlin, in the American sector, and I fell in love with an American who was teaching at a university in Germany, and we got married, and the question of a honeymoon political came up. And this presented a problem. I had been living in Europe for a number of years. She had been living in Europe a number of years. We had traveled a great deal, and practically every country in Europe had ghosts of some sort that we did not wish to meet on our honeymoon. There were two countries. So there were two countries where neither she nor I had been. One was Albania, and the other was Romania. And Albania was quite out of the question for an American diplomat at that time. So it, by process of elimination, became Romania. And we went to Romania and spent about 3 weeks here in 1957, the year we were married. I regret to say the marriage lasted about 4 years. The love affair with Romania has never stopped. And a few years later, in 1983, I found myself in Washington on a Washington assignment, and I was working for the director of an agency, and a vacancy unexpectedly occurred in our embassy in Romania. And since I was the first Foreign Service officer who saw, he asked me if I would be willing to go. And I said I most certainly would. When do I leave? And he said, after you have some language instruction, which, as you see, was not enough. And I went to Romania.
I haven't yet seen it, or just said the syllabus report.
Maybe you'll hear of it. In any event, I came to Romania in '83. It was considered at that time in the to be a hardship post. Therefore, you stayed for 2 years. It was a short assignment. And I stayed the entire 2 years, and at the end of it, I requested an extension. And since they were having trouble finding people to come to Romania, for obvious reasons at that time, they gave me the extension. At the end of 3 years, I was enjoying it so much I requested another extension. And they gave it to me, so I ended up spending 4 years here. During.
But that is more or less the normal.
It is now, but it wasn't then.
Wasn't then? It was only 2 years.
It was only 2 years. It was the standard assignment. You know, it was a greater hardship post.
It's not so convenient. It's too short. Just
of course,
acquainted with things and.
But you didn't have a chance to get acquainted with much. If you were an American diplomat in Romania in the mid-1980s, your movements, well, at least your acquaintances, were quite restricted, as you can imagine. And we can talk about that if you're interested in what it was like to be an American diplomat in communist Romania. And if you're interested, please ask questions on the subject. In any event, having spent 4 years here, somewhat unexpectedly, I went back to Washington on the assumption that after 4 years in this kind of a place at that kind of a time, I was going to get a very good assignment. And I went in to meet with my personnel officer, and I pointed out how much I had sacrificed, which of course was no sacrifice, I loved every minute of it, how much I had sacrificed for the United States, and they really owed me London, Paris, Rome, something like that. And he smiled rather sagely, and he said, Dr. Latham, he said, I don't think you understand how this is viewed in Washington. 3 years a hero, 4 years a lunatic. But in any case, I went on to Athens, which was considered and was a very pleasant assignment, not least because it allowed me to come back to Romania frequently. And went back to Washington and retired from Foreign Service in '93. And at that time, of course, the revolution had taken place in Romania. She was not spent in
Athens, which years exactly?
I was in Athens between '87 and 1990.
So the revolution had occurred in the last year or something.
That's right. That's right.
And did you travel those days here?
Yes, up to a point. For reasons known best to the Romanian authorities at that time, I went on the stop list, so-called, in 1988. And I couldn't get a visa. And then, for reasons known best to the Romanian authorities, in December of '89, just before your revolution, I got a call from the Romanian embassy in Athens saying, your visa is here. So I went to Romania in December of '89, missing the revolution.
A nice anticipation.
I missed the revolution by about 4 days. But of course came back as quickly as I could in January, and I've been coming back as quickly as I can ever since.
How did you find things here during those days, weeks, months after the revolution?
Well, of course, when I arrived in January, you could still smell cordite on the streets in Bucharest, and the country was in turmoil. It was unclear what kind of a government, what kind of a constitution, what kind of a society. There were some, I would say, fantastic theories of government which were floating at that time, and it was a very exciting time. This was a Romania I hadn't seen, however much I had devoutly wished for.
Before continuing onwards, Tell us a few things about your PhD here in Bucharest. It's also a little bit exotic.
Yeah, it was very exotic from any number of points of view. I was the cultural attaché. I had a strong academic background. As I mentioned, we had trouble meeting people and entering into Romanian society at that time. And so I thought it might be a possibility to enroll in a doctoral program at the University of Bucharest, in the hopes that that would bring me into touch with academics and students and so forth. Well, your authorities at that time saw through that immediately, and the last thing in the world they wanted was an American diplomat roaming around in the University of Bucharest. And my background is in history. I'm a professional historian. I wanted to get into the history department, and they were having no part of that whatsoever. In the best Marxist tradition, who controls the past controls the future. And the last thing in the world they wanted was an American coming in and upsetting that sequence with dissonant ideas. So they decided they would put me in the Department of Philology, a subject I had never studied in my entire life. Philology.
Yeah, well, what subject, what issue did you?
Well, that was the compromise we worked out. I said that I really thought I belonged in the history department, and in the Ministry of Education, the answer came back, Latham, we don't care if you're writing your dissertation on macromolecular chemistry, you're doing it in the Department of Philology.
Philology meaning
studying
Romanian letters or the English and American?
It was never clear to me because, of course, I never took any courses in it.
But you did enter the building here in the Garchine Street or
Peter
Okay, so it was the English department. Foreign language, the so-called Germanic language.
The Germanic languages, which again I did not take any courses in.
And who was your scientific?
Well, this was of course part of the Romanian awareness of what we were up to. Rather than have me, of course, going into Peter Mosh, a building I entered twice in 3 years. They brought a professor out of retirement, so I wasn't going to contaminate anybody who was active at the time. Very happily for me, because the professor they decided to bring out of retirement was the renowned Leon Levitsky. And so I had the great privilege of working with him in the course of about 3 years. But we did not work in Peterborough. We did not work at the University of Bucharest. Most of our work took place at lunch in Capsia.
Not bad, not bad. Okay, so I did also privilege to have Mr. Levitsky as a professor in one of his last years of teaching, I think. When I was in my first year of study at the same department, Mosh, that was in the year 77, 78, 79. So renowned Shakespeareologist and very British-like gentleman had to accompany the adventure of an American diplomat landed in Bucharest.
Yes, and I must say that it was one of the high points of my 4 years was to work with Professor Levitsky. A wonderful man, extraordinary background. He'd been on the Eastern Front in signals intelligence in the Second World War, which did not stand him in very good state in the 40s. Well, he was a Bessarabian, so he was brought up bilingual. He spoke both Romanian and Russian.
That's a very Latham-like issue for a future article on Professor Levitsky and his background and his involvement on the front in the World War and things like that.
He wasn't going to talk about that much, and not at all in the 1940s. But as I say, in the course of time, we became very friendly, and I suppose the word is trust here. He began to trust me, I began to trust him, and it became a very, very productive relationship on several levels. It had been my intention when I returned to Washington, as I knew I would in a few years, to bring him over to give him a particular place to stay in Washington so he could work in our very famous Folger Shakespeare Library, which is the largest Shakespearean library in the world. Unfortunately, the professor died not long after the Revolution, and so I have set up a collection of material in that library in his memory, Romanian Shakespearean work, translations, interpretations, posters from plays, anything to do with Shakespeare and Romania. And when I started, as you might imagine, there was very little in the Folger Library, and now the collection in the Folger Library from Romania is larger than the collection from Poland, and is exceeded only from Eastern Europe by the collection from Russia.
So what was your PhD about?
I wrote a PhD on the American author, pathologist Oliver Wendell Holmes. And I was looking at it, see, I bent this toward my own background, intellectual history, and it was a study of the writings of Oliver Wendell Holmes on history, on tradition, what he did in his writings, novels and poetry, which dealt with tradition and the past.
Pathologist, you said?
Yes, he was a professor of pathology at Harvard University. That's often forgotten because, of course, he's much more well-known as one of that group of New England authors clustered around Emerson and Melville and Thoreau and so on, the Saturday Club. Most of them Harvard graduates like himself. But his actual professional life was as a pathologist in the medical school at Harvard.
Yeah, I was not aware of that. That reminds me of the fact that I did promise, my friend Paul was no longer here, my medical doctor friend, who was here at the beginning, and he asked me to announce, he's involved in this Romanian project, that today is the International Day of Hemophilia. And he and his Lions Club are fighting against this disease and trying to assist kids suffering from hemophilia. So, if you don't mind, I just make this announcement. You wrote your PhD, you flew back to the States, then back to Europe, Athens, visited Romania during the months after the revolution. And how did your professional career go on after you retired from the diplomatic service in '93, you said?
Yes, I retired in '93, and two things were true. The first was that Romania was now out and knitting itself back into the family of nations, into the Atlantic community, Western Europe, and there was a certain dearth, a certain lack of information about Romania in Washington. I, by virtue of having lived here for 4 years and having taken a very active interest in Romanian culture, suddenly found myself as something of an expert. As we say, in the kingdom of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. And I was kind of a one-eyed Romanian expert in a kingdom of a lot of blind people. So I got involved in a lot of activities with the Smithsonian Institution, with the Department of State, and other foundations and non-governmental organizations in Washington. That was the first thing. And then I would have to be quite frank.
For what? For projects or assistance or whatever, symposia or conferences or what?
And, you know, people flattered me that they wanted my opinion on things, and I gave it to them. Whether they acted on them or not, I don't know. But in any case, I found myself responding to a need, and that, of course, caused me to intensify my interest in Romania. And that was the first thing, and I would have to say the second thing was there appeared on the scene in 1993-94 as the cultural counselor in the Romanian embassy, Ioana Ierini, and she played a major role in exploiting me and driving me into situations that I had not foreseen and was not necessarily prepared for, but hopefully rose to the occasion. And we worked during her 4 years as the cultural counselor very closely.
By the way, just excuse me for interruption, am fost nedelicat neanunțând ceea ce se vedea cu ochiul liber. Iona Ieronim a mai fost la Cafeneaua noastră, o prietenă apropiată, o mare poetă și o excepțională traducătoare, sau invers, o excepțională poetă și o mare traducătoare, după cum preferi. Și, cum deja domnul Latham a spus, o colaboratoare, o prietenă a domniei sale, de care Ioana m-a și ajutat să provizăm această seară și, de asemenea, ne stă alături în caz că e nevoie de tradus sau de... și oricum contez pe ajutorul lui Ioana și pentru bunul mers al discuției. De asemenea, nu vreau să fiu o nedelicatețe pentru că n-am anunțat de la bun început ceea ce se vede iarăși cu ochiul liber, și anume că editura Vremea, care a publicat această splendidă carte în limba engleză, deci într-o formulă editorială româno-americană, așa cum este și conținutul cărții, are nevoința să se afle aici reprezentanții săi. Sunt exemplare de vânzare la un preț posibil un discount. Am văzut că scrie acolo 24 de lei. Cine vrea să obțină un autograf acordat cu mâna stângă de la americani, scrie cu stânga, costă 24 de lei chestia asta. Exemplarele sunt acolo și colegii noștri, să ne aveți și noastră și autoritățile noastre, să să veniți aici. Doamna Silvia Popescu, directoarea editurii, nu este în București asta și poate veți să participă la întâlnirea noastră. În sală, pe lângă obișnuința cafenelei, doctorand, ale mele, astfel, la facultatea de litere, sunt și alți prieteni, unii dintre ei cu legături cu zona româno-americană, așa, sau culoarul român-american. Avem și încă un american aici, la invitat, domnul Nou Canizo, un alt marțial american este Iosul Kleina de Șam, care a trăit ani în Bull, în Statele Unite, a fost pe jurnalist al departamentului român al Voice of America, după care, să zicem, ca și americanul ăsta, a migrat înapoi spre Europa, a fost jurnalist și la BBC și la Europa Liberă pe vechiul continent, Europa Liberă fiind, bineînțeles, totul radio-american. Și mai sunt și alți și americanist la bază ca și mine, și student ca și mine, Levitski și așa mai departe. Bun, este și doamna Dandu Florescu de la Radio Internațional, de emisiune în limba engleză, și era și doamna de la emisiune în limba română. Bun, vă mulțumesc pentru tuturor. Sorry for the interruption. I just wanted to point out that Ioana is here near us and helping us.
Very much so, and it's a great pleasure. This is in coordination and cooperation, which is now 20 years old and continues tonight as you see. And just a footnote on the matter of this book, you may be interested to know that an English, a Romanian translation is in progress. I was flattered and pleased to learn that Professor Vianu, with her advanced English students, will be translating this book into Romanian. Mrs. Ieronim will be proofing it, and it will be brought out in a Romanian version later this year.
Also by the Ghana Publishing House?
That, I'm not sure.
Co-publishing solution.
There is a project maybe to...
Please take the mic.
Este un proiect ca...
Foarte bine românește.
Da, sigur. Proiectul ar putea duce către o idee de a face un volum din materia aceasta cu niște adaos al autorului care să se refere chiar la București. Există și ideea să se facă un volum online, deci este un proiect flexibil, un proiect în mers.
Mulțumesc. And how did you get into your job or work or expertise related to that encyclopedia with the articles on Romania? I understand that was...
Yes, in 2000, the Encyclopedia Britannica, now located in Chicago, approached me to revise their entries on Romania and Moldova.
Was that before or after you had written your study on the 11th edition of the Encyclopedia?
That was actually before.
So you benefited from the documentation they supplied themselves, or you just researched in libraries?
Research in libraries on the line, national statistical volumes, both for Moldova and for Romania.
Let me just add that, for those who don't know the book, haven't yet written it, în carte, printre studiile domnului Latham, este unul foarte interesant despre felul în care e prezentată România în ediția 11-a a Enciclopediei Britannica, România sau urmărind cu o minuție formidabilă, foarte valabil pentru toate problemele care le abordează. E uimitor, cum o temă, excursia în România a unui grup de lucrători în unei companii americane în anii nu știu care s-au păstrat de atunci jurnalul de călătorie și un raport, jurnalele de călătorie mai multora și un raport final, nu s-au publicat niciodată, ele există depozitate într-un fond de bibliotecă, într-o arhivă. Domnul Ernest a identificat lucrurile astea și reface contextul istoric, personaje, autorități românești la data respectivă, interese de investiții, observații făcute și scoate în maniera pe care aici în Europa o numim a noi istorie, a școlii de la anal, maniera broderiană și așa mai departe, lusoferdiană, reface o întreagă secțiune de istorie, focalizând doar asupra câte unui lucru care pare de detaliu. Studiul despre ediția 11-a Enciclopediei Britannica și despre următoarele, de fapt, a 12-a. 12-a urmărește felul în care prezența României în această imens prestigioasă lucrare lexicografică evoluează în funcție de cum evoluează România ca stat istoric, pentru că ediția 11 apare în 1916 sau așa ceva, deci în timpul primului război mondial, pe când România era încă România mică și urmează să se producă finele războiului, dezintegrarea Imperiului Austriac, constituirea României mari, completarea părții noastre de stat național și toate lucrurile astea pot fi urmărite în felul în care au evoluat descrierile din articolele respective și în condițiile în care, în acea perioadă, România și Marea Britanie erau state aliate. Deci e foarte important. Ioana, te rog.
Vreau, doar asta să completez că, într-adevăr, este fascinant acest eseu. Pune și în valoare contribuția lui Moses Gaster, ceea ce este cu totul impresionant. Și eu am avut ocazia, tocmai pentru că el chiar mi-a dăruit ediția în care există încă materialele dinainte de primul război mondial și am avut ocazia să-mi întâlnesc și prieteni, știți, cum ar fi un Adam Sorkin, marele traducător din poezia românească. Această enciclopedie are încă răbdarea și minuția ea însăși să prezintă o lume care nu avea să mai arate la fel și din care totuși noi încă mai ținem minte că ne tragem. Sunt familii care, știu eu, sunt din Ucraina, etc. Deci este foarte interesant, un spot foarte interesant pe care îl pune. Pentru că, într-adevăr, enciclopedia britanică oglindește această lume în uriașă mișcare.
Mulțumesc, Ioana. How much was it to revise in the whatever edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica when they contacted you and invited you to join the staff?
Well, there was a considerable amount of revision because the articles on Romania, and of course Moldova had not existed as a sovereign state when that entry was made, great deal had changed. We were only some 10 years away from the revolution here, and obviously there was a great deal of revision to be done. I must mention...
How many years have passed since the previous edition? What was the distance between editions at that time?
I think about 12 years.
12 years.
I should mention that the early history of Romania, that is up until the really beginning of the 20th century, was not revised by me, but by the considerably more famous American historian of Romania, Keith Hitchens. And the Encyclopedia Britannica had Keith Hitchens look at the early history of Romania, and I looked at more contemporary issues.
So you did have to write yourself parts of the information the articles about Romania.
I think
Another big change. Another big change.
We're in an even bigger change this year with Britannica, because this will be the last printed Britannica which will appear. From now on, Britannica will be available on the internet, but not in a printed form.
If not for the decision, might maybe people think, maybe sometimes someone will decide let's print it again.
Not impossible.
Why not?
No.
Okay, and how did you switch to the foreign service again, this time as a professor? Why did you when and why you
actually
delivered regular courses or
as soon as I retired from the Foreign Service in '93, the Foreign Service Institute, which is sort of the graduate school in the Department of State for personnel who will be going out and serving in our embassies, asked me to do the area studies. The Foreign Service Institute is divided into 3 sections. One teaches languages, and it employs, of course, only...
I know Cora Tudoran, for example, was teaching that, she still is.
I think so. Yes. And that's all taught by native speakers. And then there is what we call tradecraft, which is how to be a diplomat, how to write economic reports, how to handle visa requests, tradecraft. And then lastly, there are area studies, which is what I was teaching. I did and do area studies for both Romania and Moldova. That basically is looking at the culture, the history, the nature of the society, its prejudices, its concerns. It's to prepare a diplomat for living in the country and understanding the country. And I continue to lecture at the Foreign Service Institute in that connection.
And you're doing that every year, certain periods, or it's a continual
well,
operation?
Yes, I do it now at the invitation of the Institute. I did it regularly on a weekly basis for many years, except for 2 years between 2000 and 2002, when I was, as you mentioned, a Fulbright professor here in the country.
Okay, so that's more or less the personal background of Professor Latham, his professional career, public career, service career, academic career, and so on. And this is the book, so let's talk about now, let's focus a little bit more on the book. Maybe you would just be nice and tell us how do you pick up subjects in this very Sherlock Holmes-like manner, just discovering details of history, unknown manuscripts, things like that, and building up around all these things.
Well, it's very much a personal, I might say, an intellectual Epicurean thing. I do what I want to do. And if I see a subject that has not been explored, and I guess that's most of the ones in this book, exception of Olivia Manning perhaps, and it interests me, and I think that it will interest other people in the English-speaking world, all 17 of my readers, then I go at it, and I do my research, and the results you have before you. This book is, of course, a compilation of such essays written over a period of about 20 years. and they're presented in the book in sort of categories, diplomats, World War II, that sort of thing.
By the way, speaking of research, and you already mentioned libraries and so on, tell us a few words about your own library. For I understand it is sort of a legend in the small world of Romanian experts in the U.S., but small, but rather sizable continent.
Well, it got its start, of course, when I was stationed here in the mid-'80s. It was clear to me then that there were forces at work which were destroying and mutating the Romanian culture. And so I set about a collection of such things before they got destroyed. And I was looking, of course, for books with a particular bibliographic or historical interest, with the idea that I was going to donate them to my university in the United States. And
you did that when you were here? So
I did when I was here, yeah.
That is one thing which maybe some other people here also noticed. I did notice that over and over again over the years, that there is a certain pattern of diplomats hunting for books and whatever cultural documentation they may retrieve from the Romanian society in order to take it back home when leaving the service here, and still preserving a little bit of Romania after Romania, so to say.
I think that's true, both on a public and a private level. As I say, my interest originally focused on getting out everything that I could that I thought might be destroyed. As an example, Voiculescu, the author, was by profession a doctor, and he served in the medical corps in the First World War with the Royal Romanian Army. And his first book of poetry, which was published in the 1920s, he sent an inscribed copy to his old commanding officer in the medical corps. Well, I had a chance to get that, and I, of course, got it as an example of the sort of thing that I was afraid was going to get destroyed, and I wanted to save. And I particularly sought out illustrated materials that brought out the full richness of Romanian graphic arts between the two world wars in Romania and East Belgica, and that sort of thing, with the idea that I would do my little bit to curtail the activities of some of the authorities in Bucharest. In the event, of course, the revolution came. This was no longer necessary. There was nobody destroying books at that point, or ever since, thank goodness. And so...
we don't have the strongest hegemonial consciousness here in Romania. From time to time, scholars and other public personalities just draw attention to the fact that things keep being destroyed.
But it all started with burning the university library. Didn't it start like that in December of 1989?
That was, let's say, the founding, the sacrifice of the new Romanian democracy after communism.
Well, I'll leave you, Joanna, free to comment on that. I have no expertise that I can share with you on what's happened in that regard after '89. In any event, things did change for me and my library in '89. And at that point, as I say, I was evolving into something of an expert on Romanian questions. And so my reading took a far more contemporary form, and I was reading material which was being published. And I was reading it as it was being published. And that's pretty much my situation today. The library has continued to grow in size. And I don't know how many hundreds of volumes I have on Romanian subjects. Certainly it is close to 1,000. And I considerably perplexed as to what to do with this. But I'm working with some other Romanian scholars in the United States to see if we can come up with a useful
Are they borrowing? Are they asking you to borrow the volumes?
Well, if they do, I would say no, because it is not a lending library, and I've had very bad luck with lending books over the years, so I don't do it anymore. It is used as a resource in Washington. I'm frequently asked by the Library of Congress for information that my library can provide. I don't lend them the books, but I'll take them up there so they can Xerox what they need.
And except for what you just said, the autograph request do you have other documents, handwritten documents like that, dedications or whatever?
Yes, I do.
More rare things, let's say, bibliographic, bibliophilic.
Adrian Maniu, Blaga, and so other
books with autographs.
Yeah, inscribed or otherwise personalized. Yeah, I do have a copy of the Gospels of 1688 in the Cafeneaua Bible.
Okay, well preserved, I understand. It's there.
Well, I would like to think so. I've had to have some restorative work done on it. The Gospels, of course, play an important role as the Gospels in the Liturgia. And the copy that I got my hands on had about 3 centuries worth of candle wax all over it. And I had to have it professionally restored when I was in Athens.
Speaking of the book, and I just talk maybe more about the book, but it's open. I think we should open to discussions and questions and answers. Let me first ask you something about another text in this book. There was a study there about the British and American journalists in Romania during the Second World War, at the beginning of the war, 39,
yes.
41, 42. And you have listed and briefly described biographies and professional profiles of 40 British and American journalists in Romania at the time. I think it's rather amazing. Maybe count American journalists in Iraq today, there are hundreds or thousands, so 40 is not so much, but at that time, in a country which was not so much in the front stage of international politics, it's quite amazing, and it's precious information. You have retrieved all these names and their profile. How did you do that?
Well,
describe us.
It was not. Romania was not that far out of history at that time. In 1940, Europe was already at war. Germany and the Soviet Union in September of '39 had invaded and destroyed Poland, and there was a great deal of interest in events in Europe. And of course, with the Blitzkrieg in France and the lowlands, and eventually the conquest of Norway, there was a great deal of interest. And the question came, how were Anglo-American journalists going to cover this story? Well, they could cover it from London, but that was only one side of the picture. There was no way that British journalists could get into Nazi-dominated Europe, Berlin. There were a few Americans who stayed on in Berlin. So that left 2 options for the journalists in Western Europe. One was Sweden, which was still neutral and would remain neutral. But that was too far away from the story. And then there was Switzerland. Well, that was right in the center of the European maelstrom. But the Swiss had had very unfortunate experiences with journalists in the First World War. Many of them turned out to be working for their intelligence organizations and proved to be quite embarrassing to the Swiss. So they were not going to do this a second time. And the Swiss effectively were not giving visas to any journalists.
The Swiss have enough spies.
They had enough spies, yes. And they didn't want any more. And as I say, they'd had a bad experience in the First World War with spies. So, where did they go? They went to Romania.
Plus Lenin's and others.
Yes.
Not to mention.
On his way to the Finland station. Well, Romania became the place. And as a result, major journalists from Britain and from the United States, in the case of the Americans, several of whom would eventually receive Pulitzer Prizes, which is the accolade in the journalist profession in the United States. So they came to Romania. And of course, Romania was a major opportunity. In October of 1940, the Germans sent into Romania, ostensibly at the request of the Romanian government, as a training unit for training the Romanian army, in actual fact here to garrison the oil fields around Ploiești, which the Allies had destroyed, had spiked in the First World War. The Germans weren't taking a chance on that happening in the Second World War. And when they had gone into Paris in June of 1940, they had found in the French Foreign Office documents which indicated the French and British were prepared to do the same thing again. So they sent in the units which would garrison the Ploiești oil fields. So that gave these journalists an opportunity to meet with and to talk with Germans, which they otherwise would not have an opportunity to do. And everybody knew that the German war machine was going to move on. It was a question whether it was going to move south, across Bulgaria and into Greece, as it eventually did, or it was going to move east, across the Prut and into the Soviet Union, as it eventually did. So this was a very good place for journalists to be, particularly if they were journalists from combatant countries, such as Great Britain, or from neutral countries, as the United States remained until the end of '41.
It's just the research, the press in Britain or major American newspapers identifying correspondence in Bucharest, or how did you do it?
Well, in part by looking at the press at the time, who was filing from Romania. Then one led to another. That is to say, one would leave and write his or her memoirs and would mention journalists that he or she had known in Bucharest. So I would then go in and see if these people had written a book and whether I could get a hold of it. Fortunately, I live in Washington. I have at my disposal the Library of Congress, and so most books I can get a hold of. And so, as I say, one led to another. Robert St. John, for example, one of our more famous American correspondents, wrote his memoirs, Foreign Correspondent. And it mentions a number of journalists. Countess Waldeck wrote Athene Palas in 1942. She mentioned people that she had known and worked with here in Bucharest. So I would just, one would lead to another until I thought I had a pretty complete list, and it's in the book.
Okay, Ioana, will you add something to what we have discussed so far with Latham, and vă invit pe toată lumea, cineva să pună întrebări, să comenteze, să reacționeze, să adauge ceva. Mi s-au adăugat și alți colegi, prieteni și tineri cercetători, dar și prietenii mei care s-au strâns acolo în spate și sunt foarte faimoși, și Gabriela Andreescu și Lidia Totoc. Dacă simțiți nevoia să interveniți, vă rog să o faceți cu toții.
Eu nu aș vrea să vă rețin. Sigur că este într-adevăr, este foarte interesant să vezi cum a lucrat, pentru că interesul lui pentru România s-a tradus profesional, într-un mod exemplar. Și aș zice că, în afară că este și un scriitor talentat, pentru că pur și simplu sunt atrăgătoare când le citești, în pofida informației precise și ample, știe să pună în pagină într-un fel care rămâne atrăgător, suntem de acord la asta, nu? Însă cred că are și un instinct interesant, pentru că, iată, a bântuit anticariatele din România, acum și librăriile, dar zicem anticariate, unde a găsit acele ediții rare, lucruri. Și le avea, nu în colecția lui, însă are un fel de instinct să găsească, și am să numesc ceva ce nu a fost numit aici. El are unul din studiile acestea, se bazează pe un fel de manual, sau cum să zic, o carte care se dădea militarilor români care plecau în război. Deci este un fel de discurs patriotic, să spunem, pentru un soldat care merge și riscă viața pentru propria patrie. A analizat textele acestea și a comparat și cu un manual chiar de școală din Italia lui Mussolini. Deci sunt pur și simplu are instinctul să găsească aceste materiale și un talent și o intuiție de a scoate esența din ele. Iată, exemplele acestea sunt foarte mici și totuși extrem de expresive. Asta am vrut să adaug. Poate că, pentru că a fost menționată colaborarea mea cu el, am să spun că eu am ajuns la Washington ca, mă rog, consilier cultural, deci atașat cultural. În 90...
A fost un moment despre care tinerii de aici habar n-au prins epoca. A fost un moment în care în România, primei etape post-comuniste, cu încă, hai să spunem așa, foarte generic, puternice sechele ale vechiului regim și cu o guvernare foarte criticată și de democrațiile occidentale și de noi, marea majoritatea intelectualității românești care erau mulțumiți de imperfecta democratizare din România. Și în acest context, la un moment dat, puterea politică, guvernarea a făcut un fel de concesii intelectualilor, făcând un acord cu Uniunea Scriitorilor, în urma căruia acord Uniunea Scriitorilor urmea să furnizeze, cred că 6 până la urmă, scriitori care să fie trimiși atașați cultural la ambasadele României din diverse țări, în funcție, bineînțeles, și de limbile, literaturile pe care scriitorii pe care Uniunea i-a propus le cunoșteau. Și așa a ajuns Ioana Eronim, atașat cultural la Washington, Eugeniu Ricaru la Atena, Sin la Ierusalim.
Nu, adică la Tel Aviv. Grete Dachtler la Viena.
Grete Dachtler la Viena, după aceea Grete a continuat carieră diplomatică, a fost ambasadoare.
Dar eu vreau să spun ceva feminist aici, dintre cei 6 eram 2 femei, eu și Grete. Grete chiar a fost de cursă foarte lungă, eu am făcut serviciu doar la Washington și m-am retras din diplomație, însă băieții nu au rezistat. Și Gheorghe Schwarz în Germania, la Berlin. Însă femeile, noi 2 am rezistat și am rezistat un tur complet peste 4 ani. Grete a mers mai departe cu cariera diplomatică, însă băieții au cedat. Pentru că, de fapt, sistemul respingea. Am fost niște răcoaice singuratice. Da. În orice caz, am vrut să spun aici, pentru că l-avem pe Ernest Latham și despre asta e vorba, este că, deși, sigur, am vorbit străine și noi știm că asta era o școală foarte deschisă, adică am fost norocoși să facem o asemenea școală în regimul respectiv și să învățăm multă cultură universală.
By the way, când am fost românește, da? Când am fost eu student la anglistică, eu ca student i-am întâlnit, de pildă, în întâlniri cu studenții aici, pe Saul Bellow, pe Tony Tanner, care era un jurnalist cultural, critic literar, author of City of Words, which was o carte de autoritate literară în America Periferiei, pe un lapsus, romanciera britanică cea mai faimoasă din ultimele decenii. În fine, o serie întreagă de nume, da, o serie, Iris Murdoch, cu soțul ei și el mi se pare romancier. Deci erau în România comunistă a perioadei, totuși erau un culoar foarte cosmopolit, limbile străine și când se întâmpla să vin aici pentru alte scopuri. Saul Bellow cred că venise aici pentru un eveniment de familie, cred că fiind căsătorit cu o româncă, cred că murise cineva, soacra, sau ceva. Și ambasada americană a organizat o asemenea întâlnire la facultatea de limbi străine la engleză și l-am văzut pe Saul Bellow bucuros după aceea, nu știu, sau luase deja, primise deja pe Nobel, sau după aceea a primit, în orice caz, pentru niște tineri intelectuali în perioada respectivă, era ceva spectaculos.
Deci asta am vrut să spun, că nu aveam neapărat un complex sau făceai ce se putea mai bine și mai ales deschideai niște uși care au fost încleiate mulți ani înainte. A fost pentru mine o experiență foarte interesantă. Însă am avut un fel de principiu care a venit și recunosc și din lipsă pur și simplu de mijloace materiale. Foloseam tot ce se putea folosi care exista în spațiu. Și foloseai, de exemplu, fulbrătorii români care veneau în America. Foloseai fulbrătorii americani care se întorceau din România. Foloseai tot ce se putea pentru un număr, pentru foarte multe feluri de programe pe care cel puțin în primul l-am organizat. Însă, felul de a te referi la realitățile românești ca român, indiferent de această deschidere, nu poate să aibă aceeași priză și nu poate să fie recepționat la fel de bine ca atunci când este spus de un american. Deci, iată, realitățile noastre, în primul rând, că chiar și temele, pentru noi nu sunt la îndemână. Noi ne mirăm să le vedem pe acestea și sunt atât de expresive. Sigur că Ernest nu este singurul, însă a avut pentru mine o valoare extraordinară pentru a promova valori românești. Pentru că această privire din afară, dar și din nou, prin afecțiune față de cultura română. Și ceilalți pe care noi îi știm, și sunt mai mulți decât pe care îi știm la prima vedere.
Și fața în această carte, Chitici, menționat de...
E un discurs care se...
Nu-i nicio supărare sau mai rup scaune la Cafeneaua. Să critică, te rog, Emanuel, foarte bine, mai iau. Al patrulea pe care îl rup chiar tu? Da, al patrulea
rup Cafeneaua. Nu numai că am merge acolo, pentru mine a fost o experiență și de rafinarea unui simț al identității proprii. De la distanță te vezi altfel și începi să te vezi poate mai nuanțat, însă și acest dialog al vocilor despre noi înșine, venit din partea lor, prin cineva, care are și metodologie și sentimentul, are și inima la loc unde trebuie, este extrem de prețios. Și, într-adevăr, despre aceasta e vorba. Și eu
cineva care și-a și declarat în această serie un amor de durabil.
Da, exact, exact. Și care este și unul lucid și unul cunoscător. Deci, asta am vrut eu să adaug.
Mulțumesc din nou, Ioana. Intervenții, întrebări, profităm că Ernest e cu noi și să bombardăm. Vlad? Te rog.
Just a curiosity, such books as you've took to the States were quite well defended by the office of the official patrimony. How did you do to take 1,000 precious books to the States?
Well, I guess I could talk about it now.
Just a second. I need again, I feel I need to supply this brief piece of information for the youngsters here. A scoate cărți, nu numai tablouri și a scoate cărți, da, spune Vlad Arghit, mai vechi de câteva decenii, au scrisă pe pagina an de apariție, nu știu, de 20 și ceva, în cazul ediției, prima ediție de poezie Voiculescu, punea probleme de patrimoniu. Trebuia să treci pe la oficiu de patrimoniu, să obții o ștampilă, niște hârtii însoțitoare și putea să nu fie foarte ușor. Înainte, pentru tot ce era de dinainte de 45. Întrebarea lui Vlad Arghit, deci cum ați reușit să scoateți din România asemenea lucruri fără, în cantități destul de considerabile?
Well, I've never talked about that before tonight, but I guess I can now. You know, we're much concerned about we're much concerned about alleged corruption in Romania now and the damage it's doing to the Romanian economy and reputation. But believe me, it hardly holds a candle to the corruption that went on in the communist period. And yes, there was a patrimony. And when I left Romania, they came in with my movers. I was moving on to Athens, you'll recall, and the movers came up with trucks from Greece, and two officials from the Office of Patrimony arrived. And I sat them down in my living room with 2 glasses and a bottle of scotch. By 10 o'clock, they were asleep. They woke up at 5 o'clock, went home, appeared at 8 o'clock the next morning. They got another bottle of scotch, and also a large briefcase full of Kent 100s, lipstick, nail polish, and some other unmentionables which were unavailable in Romania at the time, and they never said a word. And I had what I wanted to take out of the country. So that's the answer to your question.
That's the nice and funny part of the whole story. For probably in the same way, lots of other people smuggle out lots of other things, not so positively, so to say, as you did, books in order to establish or enrich your personal library, which is also accessible for others. But huge patrimony values were taken out of the country, probably in these ways.
And I would submit that some of these items were being exported by the government itself. I remember this dramatically, not in the case of Romania, but I was in the American military government, the American sector of Berlin, and the East German officials, and some very high-ranking and recognizable names, were coming over to West Berlin with suitcases full of Ostmark, the currency of East Germany, and turning them over to banks, which of course by East German standards highly illegal. And we were very interested in what they were going to do now that they had the Westmark, the Bundesmark. And you know where they all went in West Berlin was IKEA. And they bought furniture and bookcases and waste paper baskets and all kinds of things and went back to East Berlin. So there was a constant rolling out. In Vienna, there was a store down in the Graben, a shop, which was flogging Russian icons. And we knew that these were coming in with the approbation and indeed the encouragement and the support of the Soviet government to earn hard currency. And individuals could never have left the Soviet Union with those icons, but there they were in the Graben in Vienna for sale. So the entire Warsaw Pact was leaking patrimony.
First of all, I'd like to contribute to your rare things collection because I'd like to offer to you a poetry book launched in the United States, a book written together with a poet, Romanian poet from Ohio. This book was launched at the Taste of Romania Festival in Chicago in 2004 in September. This book has some poems in memory of 9/11, and it's a privilege to offer to you.
Great privilege for me to accept it. Thank you very much.
After that, questions. But
you certainly deserve a question.
Okay, but for you, and I'd like to include and Mrs. Ivana into the question. So I have a doctorate about Poe at the UNESCO, and from my European point of view, I have a revolutionary vision about Poe. I can see that from European point of view, the exponential poet of America, and of course, that depends on and so on. I'd like to ask your vision about Poe in comparison with Walt. This is a question, how do you perceive Poe? And the same question for Ivana. Because in America, at this moment, they appreciate Poe only for his black short prose. What could be available to make horror movies, to sell a lot of black things. Do you have a perception about Poe as a great poet, as by European point of view, the greatest American poet? Thank you.
Well, Poe has always been valued more in Europe than in the United States. He is certainly a major figure in American literature, but not at the ascendancy that he is in, say, France. Or I was surprised to see a Hungary issued a stamp with Edgar Allan Poe on it. He is remembered for his short stories, and for his poetry, much of it noir, much of it dark and sinister. And he's not the only one, by the way. The French attribute extraordinary significance to Howard Phillips Lovecraft. Now, Lovecraft is in some ways an enjoyable author, but he writes horror stories. And he's not accorded a position of great altitude in American literary history. But the French are very much caught up in Howard Phillips Lovecraft. And I've sat with French intellectuals and discussed Howard Phillips Lovecraft all evening long, an event which would not happen with my American colleagues.
There is a consequence also of the, I would say, reinvention of Poe, Bible Clare in Europe, and the whole tradition which has come out of that in the French literature and the European literature.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that Poe does write in France on Baudelaire's path.
Vreți să mă întrebați între Poe și Whitman? Păi, nu știu ce să spun, adică credeam că nu e neapărat seara pentru această discuție. Din punctul meu de vedere, tot anumite subiectiv ca poetă, ca, mă rog, și cititoare de poezie, mie mi se par foarte interesanți amândoi și nu-mi convine să stabilesc ierarhii. Am avut, ca să revin puțin la o discuție pe care o începuse adineaura Bogdan, am avut privilegiul să am un profesor american, Thomas Hart, un semestru, când am fost studentă, care ne-a predat un an, adică un semestru întreg, noi am analizat texte de Whitman și Emily Dickinson. Acum eu ce să vă spun, Emily Dickinson pentru mine este într-o ierarhie foarte sus, însă iarăși spun, nu mi se pare tocmai fructuos să facem o ierarhie între ei, știți? Și tocmai recitam de curând Whitman, vedeți, unele sunt piesele cele mai populare, altele sunt profunzimile lui în alte piese. Ce să discutăm astăzi seara? Ne întâlnim la o seară de poezie.
Ioan Iacov e interesat, din câte știu eu, din proiectul lui doctoral, mai ales de gradul de reprezentativitate, nu de valoare, de valoare de doi mari autori. E interesant de o paralelă între Ernest ca autor reprezentativ român și Poe ca un poet foarte compatibil în multe privințe cu Ernest și pe care el îl consideră, poate și din cauza asta, mai reprezentativ pentru spiritul american decât ceea ce de obicei se consideră că este Whitman. Whitman e considerat poetul Americii.
Yeah, I would put now two things on Walter Whitman, which perhaps Americans are more sensitive to than Europeans. The first is, of course, great contrast with Poe. Whitman is very entwined with American history. That is to say, he was a nurse in military hospitals in Washington during our Civil War, and our Civil War is probably the most significant event that happened in American history after the Revolution itself. And much of his poetry and his notebooks are focused on his experiences in military hospitals. You can see quotations from Walt Whitman as you're leaving the metro in DuPont Circle in Washington. Quotations from his experience in the Civil War and in military hospitals. I think that's the first thing that you have to remember. Poe does not have an historical identity in the United States. The second thing about Whitman is, if Poe rides on the back of Baudelaire in France, Whitman at the present time rides on the back of the beat poets. And he was picked up by Allen Ginsberg, Phelan Getty, Rex Roth, and was constantly being rehearsed and discussed by the beat poets, who went into an ascendancy in the very late 1950s and was still going strong and loud into the 1970s. And this gave Whitman a rebirth. I remember years ago seeing a film by Andre Codrescu, who kind of joined the beat movement late as an immigrant. And he did a tour of the United States called Road Scholar, a pun on Road Scholars. And one of the places he stopped in New Jersey. and spent some time, was Whitman's birthplace. So he's very much caught up with contemporary American literature as well. And that's not true with Poe.
Please. I'd like to ask you about another side of your you have many sides, obviously, and such as your sensitive questions about the U.S. system of selecting ambassadors. Okay, that's very sensitive, presumably. Over the years, I've heard that most of these are either political donors to campaigns or businessmen, that sort of thing, go. What the advantages and drawbacks are as far as those countries concerned, implications. You don't have to mention names here, I suppose.
Well, I would refer you to an op-ed piece which appeared in the Washington Post about 4 days ago, co-authored by, I think, Thomas Pickering, the formerly U.S. ambassador, and Susan Johnson, who is the president of the American Foreign Service Association, which is sort of the trade union for American diplomacy. And they were not surprisingly concerned by what they perceived to be an increasing number of political appointees and a declining number of career appointees. Having been a career diplomat, of course, I tend to support more career diplomats. But it isn't as simple as that. That is to say, career diplomats are very much under the Secretary of State, who is the head of our Foreign Office. Political diplomats couldn't care less about the Secretary of State, and they have direct access to the President, which no career diplomat has. And this is very important. There are countries in the world which do not want career diplomats as their ambassador. If they have an ambassador, they want to know if they have something important to say to the United States, it will go right to the Oval Office. And a political ambassador has that kind of access. If you review our, let us say, larger embassies in larger countries, London, Paris, Bonn, Tokyo, Beijing, they're almost always political appointees. Just because the country wants somebody there who can get into the Oval Office, can get into the President's office in the White House. And a career diplomat would generally not have that access, would have to run it through the bureaucracy, through the Secretary of State, and so on. And I will use names. Very famously was the American ambassador here between 1983 and 1985, David Funderburk. He was a political appointee. I served under him for 2 years, between 83 and 85 when he left, to go back and run for Congress from his home state of North Carolina. And by virtue of being a Republican from North Carolina, that gave him access not only to the President, but to Jesse Helms, who was the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Senate. And this is a very important person. Career diplomats would not normally have access to the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committees, of either the House or of the Senate. So this gave David a great deal of leverage. There are those, and of course David's tenure was very much a controversial thing, and it remains so. But it does give you an idea of the different quality of a career diplomat and a political appointee. Generally speaking, when a political appointee takes up a position in an American embassy overseas, the Department of State puts beside him as the number 2 person in the embassy, the Deputy Chief of Mission, to call it by his correct title, a career diplomat. And very often they work together very well. That is to say, the political appointee knows he doesn't know his way around an embassy and how it works, and the Deputy Chief of Mission does.
Well, we are highly experienced.
That's right. That would be an experienced senior American diplomat. I've seen this work out time and again. When I was in Vienna, we had a political appointee, and we had a very astute, experienced career diplomat as his deputy chief of mission. They worked very well together.